when we were doing the discussion with about methods, there's one important aspect of the discussion that we forgot to mention, and that is the use of certain keywords to actually qualify the behavior of methods parameters. There are three keywords that we use to change the default behavior of method parameters. So we're going to do we're going to do this discussion of qualifying these method parameters through an illustration using examples. For example, let's say we have a method to swap two numbers. We want a method that is able to swap two numbers. So let's write that method. Going to make it simple. Let's say swap. Do you really need to? Let's not return anything here. Let's say void for now. We'll see. So then, normally a method will look like this. Why? Cool. So here inside, then we can write a code to swap those two numbers. Code to swap those two numbers. To swap these two numbers. These two values. Cool. This is not the method to swap two numbers. So we will need to qualify the method parameters, or we'll need to decorate the method parameters with certain keywords to allow that method to be able to swap two numbers. Otherwise, if we call that method, it doesn't matter what we do here. Let's write a code that will swap the numbers. Let's say int new num is equals to x, and then we say x is whatever is in y, and then y is equals to new num. This is basically how a code that will swap two numbers would look like, except that there's a problem here. So let's say somewhere then we're going to have that where we're going to call that method, and we're going to use the main method. So inside main we call our method. Let's do this. We call our method. Let's say how are we going to do this? What exactly do you want to do? Let's declare the variables here. Num1 is equals to 2, and num2, hopefully this is going to work, is equals to 3. So now we want to swap these numbers. We want to swap these two numbers, num1 to be 3 and num2 to be 2. So we call this method swap is equals to we call this method swap num1 num2. So what we would expect, or what we are expecting, is that after we call this method, when we print the values of these numbers, like when we print the value of num1 here, we should see 3. We should see 3. When we print the value of num2, we should see 2. Unfortunately, at this stage, that's not going to happen. And the main reason is that it's the way we are passing these two arguments to that method. what we are basically doing here is to pass the copies of these values. So these numbers remain unchanged. Ne? So what we want is that when we pass these argument, we want these numbers to swap because that's the purpose. So how do we qualify or decorate these method where we are calling this method and the method and on the method parameters to allow these numbers to swap after we call this method? It's simple. We use the keyword. There are keyword that we use. Basically, what we need to do, we are passing these argument by value. That means we are passing the copies. So anything that is done to these values will not change these ones because we have passed the copies of these ones. So what we need to pass these values by reference, so that anything that is done on those references, it also affects these two variables. So how do we do that? We use a keyword in C# called ref, and that keyword is used to actually decorate the arguments to be passed by their reference rather than by their value. So what we will do, we will go to the parameters of our method and then say we want these things to be passed by reference. Ref int y. Cool. So when we call this method, we also you have to use the ref keyword again. Ref num1. We are passing the reference of num1, not the value of num1. We are passing the address of num1. Num2. Cool. Now, because we have passed the reference, let's fix this one. So now, because we have passed these values by reference, what happens is that if you try to print the value of num1, it's not 2, it's gonna be 3. If you try to print the value of num2, it's no longer 3, it's 2, because that method, it's modifying those values by their reference. It uses the address. It actually, here we're actually giving the address of these two values. So that method there, it's modifying the values of that are stored on these address. We gave that method the address of the values that need to be passed. We gave the address of num1. So we said on num1, what we are doing, we are putting what was on num2, and on num2 we are putting what was on num1. So that is why we are able to change to get these numbers swapped, because we passed them by reference. So this ref keyword is used to pass arguments by their reference, which means these these arguments can be changed somewhere in the code because they are passed by reference. When you pass them by value, you are passing their copies. So whatever you do on the copies have nothing to do with the actual values. But when you pass arguments by their reference, whatever is done on those arguments somewhere where they will be modified will affect these values, these argument variables. So by ref allows us to pass the arguments or the parameters of a method by their reference, so that they can be modified somewhere. So here is the thing. So when you pass your arguments by reference to a method, the caller, which is where the method that is expecting the argument is called, the caller have an option of assigning the values by itself. Like here we have assigned these values, or it can leave to the method that is being called to assign values into these values, into these variables. For example, let's remove these values that we have assigned. We remove these values. Now we have just declared them. Let's remove this complication. So we remove these values. Now there are no values on num1. There's nothing stored on num2. But when we go to that method, what we do, we say, okay, before we do that, let's do this. Let's say we say x is equals to 2. And then we say y is equals to 3. So then now if you print the values of num1, you will get 2. Where did you get it? Because these arguments are passed by their reference. So what the runtime is going to do, it's going to go to the address of num1 and then assign the value that was assigned to the corresponding parameter, which is x. And now we store 2 on num1. So we were able to modify the value of num1, though we do not have like an access, like a direct access to num1. We do have the access through its address. Does that make sense? So the same applies to num2. If you can print the values of num1 at this stage, after you call this method, you'll find that you have 2, you have 1, but you didn't assign these values here. So that's how you use ref. When you use ref, you have an option to assign values to the arguments, which is where you'll be calling these, where you will be calling the method that is expecting these parameters by their reference. You have an option of assigning your arguments, where you will be, the caller have an option of assigning the arguments, or it can leave up to the called method to assign these arguments, to give values to these arguments. So the second keyword that is used to decorate the parameters of a let's say of a method is out. Out is another keyword. So out is basically here the caller do not have to worry about assigning a value to out. Actually, you are not allowed to assign a value to an output parameters. So let's change our method here. Let's say we want this method to be add this time around, and then we're going to create the 2 normal variable x, int y. Then the third variable here is going to be out, int let's say sum. Cool. So now what we want is for this method it should return an integer. What we want is for this method, we had a method like this where it returns a sum, but now we have written it a bit differently, and we are also expecting it to be called a bit differently. So now we want this method to do what? To assign a value to that output parameter. Sum is equal to x plus y, and then we want to return this sum. So now we come into the caller. We want to call that method. When we call that method here, we say add. Let's start by creating variables that we are going int num1, let's say equals to 2, int num2 is equals to 3. So now we want this sum, and then we're going to save it to another variable. We say sum is equals to, we call add. Add takes 3 parameters: the numbers that we want to add plus out output parameters. What the hell is going on here? Out sum. What we should have done actually here, let's say this one is a result. This one we're going to write it as result, and then we're going to declare int sum here and not give it a value. So now what we are saying, we are calling this method. This method, because the sum parameter argument is an output parameter, this method has the responsibility of giving a value to this value, to this argument. We don't give it in our code, we just declared it and then we send it as an output parameter, which means that the method which is called the add method now has the responsibility of ensuring that it gives a value to that value. We tell it, okay, you have the responsibility to give the value to this argument. We don't have it. Cool. If the method which is called which will be expecting the output parameter, which if it does not give a value to that output parameter, then that's an error. It's an error. So when you create a method that is expecting an output parameter, then you must know that within that method body, you have to ensure that you are assigning, you are giving a value to that output parameter. Cool. So now you can print the value of sum and say console.sum. Console, actually this method didn't have to return any value. It doesn't have to return any value, not unless you want to say it. It doesn't have to return value. We should have kept it void. So now, if again you look at this code, you'll find that we didn't actually specify a value for sum here. We just specified it as an output argument, which means it's going to correspond to that output parameter. So that method knows that, okay, this one is an output parameter. That means I've got a responsibility of giving a value to this output parameter. So it takes sum and then it takes the sum of these two numbers. So now here, after this code, you can print the value of sum. The value of sum, you'll find that it's actually the sum of these two numbers. It will be 5. It will be 5. It's actually the sum. Let's just keep it like that. So if you print the value of sum, it will be the sum of these two numbers. But that number, it's not assigned by the method that is calling the method which is expecting that output parameter. So the difference between the rev output and the rev and the output keyword is that when you have created output parameters, then the method which is expecting output parameters has the responsibility of giving values to those output parameters. With rev parameters, on the other hand, the method do not have to assign values, but it can if you choose it to. Ne? Then the caller also do not have the responsibility of assigning those values. You can just decide where do you want to assign those argument which are, or those argument or parameters which are passed by reference. But with output, the caller where the method which is calling the method with the output parameter does not have to, not that it does not, must not give a value to an output parameter. It should leave that to the method that is expecting the output parameter. Cool. Let's reinstate this. We say when you use output parameters, the caller, which is where you are calling the method that is expecting an output parameter, must not assign a value to that output parameter. It should just pass it to the method. which is expecting the output parameter, and then the method have the responsibility. If the method which is expecting the output parameter does not assign a value to an output parameter, that's an error. So that's the difference between the reference, the ref keyword and the output parameter. So the third one, the third keyword which is used, it's param. So basically, to understand how param works, I think we need to do a lesson on how to work with arrays, how to create arrays, and how to manipulate arrays. We're gonna come a bit later on that. But these are the three keywords in C# which are used to decorate the arguments and parameters of methods to change their behavior.